The workplace is essentially corporate Hunger Games. Now, on this channel, when we talk about office politics, obviously we are not mentioning healthy workspaces or things that are expected or things that you should anticipate in the average work environment. Specifically, what we are getting at are essentially systems of power that have some other unspoken rules and embedded codes within such systems. So a lot of the time, people find themselves pretty much stepping into a symbolic lion's den, right? Where they're coming into workplaces and they're presenting themselves a certain way, or they're working really hard and they're shocked and sometimes even disappointed at the fact that they are not being met with promotions, with respect, with consideration, and instead maybe your counterparts who are seemingly approaching the workplace with a completely different code of conduct is getting ahead versus you're someone who's checking off all of the responsibilities, but it seems like you're taking one step just to end up 10 steps backwards. And this is intentional. One of the first things that I want people to understand is this concept of social climbing cannot be assessed with a one-dimensional mindset. And I have a separate analysis talking a little bit more about this. But in this analysis, I believe I titled it The Dangers of Social Climbing. I highlighted this uncomfortable yet super significant reality, at least a significant reality to take into consideration before you start stepping into these spaces and you start navigating these spaces, right? And that is everyone who is in a prominent position is not necessarily there because they've worked hard to get there, meaning that there are certain people who have acquired positions. This is specifically what I stated in that analysis. There are certain people who have acquired prominent positions because they've mastered the art of canceling out their competition, right? So they've learned the art of playing quote unquote office politics or utilizing office politics to their advantage to X out a competitor, to X out someone in the workplace who will highlight their inadequacies and their weaknesses. So there are certain people who will advance in a professional space and they're not necessarily skilled at the respective profession, task, position, but instead what they've learned to do is master the art of not only Xing out their competition, but master the art of allegiance. And to explain how important allegiance is, I'm actually going to read from an excerpt in this book. And the excerpt I'm going to read from is titled Allegiance to Appointment. And it reads, although we've been taught the American dream, that success comes from hard work, sacrifice, and starting from humble beginnings, meritocracy often has little to do with one's rise to affluence. Instead, it's about allegiance to individuals who already hold power and influence. But in order for a coworker to make successful allegiance with someone who is in a prominent position, a position of power, a position of leadership within the workplace, they first have had to master the principle or master the art of learning the lay of the land. And that's actually a completely separate excerpt in the book Green Eyes, actually. And to provide some context for those who aren't familiar, I'm going to read a little bit from that excerpt as well. And it reads, different territories and interactions require adaptability. Authenticity should not be compromised, but frivolous transparency can be detrimental, meaning your responses and actions should be contingent upon what is presented to you first, especially if you are new to an environment or group. So what this excerpt is getting at is what's most important before you start showcasing your capabilities and your skills. Now, of course, everything is subjective, but for the most part, when we're talking about environments that are leaning towards showing partiality to certain employees, especially if you are working under someone who doesn't necessarily lead with who does the work best, but who kisses up to the person in a position of power best, then this principle is going to be very important for you because you're going to reserve a lot of energy and avoid situations where people are getting you to jump through hoops, but you're not receiving any return on investment versus your other counterparts, on the other hand, are giving the least effort. Instead, they're just kissing up and essentially being the quote unquote personality hire, but they are moving up the food chain. And when I say the food chain, we can also talk about like a professional pyramid, so to speak, right? Just to provide some kind of metaphor or some kind of symbolic representation for what we're talking about. But learning the lay of the land helps you perceive who is at the bottom of this quote unquote pyramid and who reigns at the top. So to provide some additional context as far as how these pyramid structures work in professional settings, I'm going to read from another excerpt in the book In the Lion's Den, Navigating Systems of Power, titled Top of the Pyramid, Understanding the Dynamics of Power Structures. And it reads, systems of power are deliberately designed to cultivate a select group of leaders while cycling through subordinates as temporary talent. In truth, most pivotal decisions are made behind the scenes, long before others witness the outcome. So this excerpt is not only describing who is within these pyramids, right? But they're also describing how these pyramids work, how they sustain themselves, but most importantly, it's getting at this unspoken rule that typically decisions are made behind the scenes amongst people who are already in positions of power, meaning that there are individuals who are quote unquote subordinates within these structures who are running around like chickens with their head cut off, trying to show people that they're worthy, going above and beyond, realizing that they're doing this to no avail, right? If you are in an environment where partiality comes before performance, you have to start preserving your valuable assets and contributions because they will be used against you. And this is why these types of structures also create a lot of competition, right? So one thing that you have to understand once you learn the lay of the land and you realize that these elements are really prominent within your workplace, you have to get out of your head that you can trust in and you can rely in your coworkers. 9 times out of 10, you cannot. Because this space is so highly charged with a lack of consideration, a lack of attention, a lack of resources, maybe everything is a fight to simply work their way up the pyramid, not understanding that it's them chasing fool's gold. It's them chasing a dangling carrot. It's not designed for that. But they're keeping you all distracted with competition to hide from the fact that the partiality is the main focus of this professional space. So I'm gonna go ahead and read from another excerpt in the book In the Lion's Den to describe how this happens and why competition is typically so prominent in these spaces. And the Create Competition excerpt reads, competition keeps members controlled, divided, and distracted. When a dominating system senses losing control over its subordinates, it will spark competition among them. This keeps them focused on competing rather than on the system's true agenda. And even better, it keeps them submissive. And this is why keeping feelings of jealousy, envy, and comparison in professional spaces at bay is so important, because a lot of the time you may not realize it, but these feelings are actually being used against you, right? To fulfill a specific agenda. And if you feed into this, you won't be able to perceive the bigger hand at play. And another thing to note is this. When you are essentially leading with learning the lay of the land rather than getting blindsided or so consumed with these counterproductive emotions such as jealousy and envy with a colleague, a coworker, you won't be able to perceive the fact that you are giving a lot to a particular system, yet receiving very little. And a mistake that people often make when they're presented with such a circumstance is they go into overdrive to work even harder and to try to gain approval. Not understanding that this norm that is being set is actually designed for you to keep putting in top tier work. So another person who has been appointed a position that you don't know about, you don't know that this person has already been chosen simply through allegiance, they are essentially utilizing your work ethic to build this other person up. And this is why I keep telling people it's so important to first and foremost learn the lay of the land before you start exhausting any of your prominent energy to a particular workspace or to a particular position. A lot of the time you have to learn how to utilize this specific opportunity as a means to an end for another position. Because if they are utilizing you as revolving and cycling talent to build up the other person that they really have an allegiance to, then you're going to be out of luck because you've exhausted all of your energy and all of your resources. And to make things even worse, you decided to put all of your eggs in this counterproductive basket. Now, another thing to note is this. A lot of the time, people will exhaust a lot of your resources, your energy, and your contributions simply by moving the goalpost on you. And to provide some context, there's another excerpt that talks about this a little bit more. And of course, I want to read from that as well to provide some context. And the excerpt reads, "An envious person may set goals and assign responsibilities to their target for constant critique and revision. Not only does this tactic drain the target's time and energy, but it also serves a more sinister goal, diminishing their confidence. The continuous criticism can cause even the most self-assured individuals to second guess their efficiency and competence." So another thing that this concept of moving the goalpost is highlighting is essentially when you are working under someone who is showing partiality to someone else, or maybe even their intentions regarding you is a little bit more sinister. They may envy your potential. They may envy a particular skill set that you have. Or it might tie back to a principle that I highlighted earlier, how there are certain people who are in prominent positions because they've learned the art of canceling out their competitors, right? And there's another excerpt in the book Green Eyes that talks about a specific envious archetype titled the Malicious Mentor. And these are individuals who take people under their wing with the sole purpose of essentially hindering their progress. So in the concept of dealing with the malicious mentor, and specifically a malicious mentor who is utilizing this particular tactic of moving the goalposts with you, not only is it designed to hinder, your progress, exhaust you of your energy, your resources, but another thing to note is this: they are also trying to milk the clock on you. There's another excerpt in the book In the Lion's Den, Navigating Systems of Power, that essentially conceptualizes the importance of understanding timing, particularly the essence of a person's timing, right? Because there are some people who are working under a malicious mentor, right? An envious boss, an insecure, colleague, supervisor, whatever. And they don't realize that the past 3 to 5 years that they have been pitching themselves and trying to show themselves worthy for a particular position or promotion, if they would have just took a chance and stepped out on faith and aligned themselves with another opportunity, they would have gotten that same promotion, that position within a couple of months, maybe even a couple of weeks, and their life would look completely different within a year in comparison to the last 3 to 5 years that they've been talking in circles and constantly dealing with someone who is moving the goalpost on them. A red flag to look out for when you're working within a professional system is someone who is moving the goalpost with you, right? How are you really going to be able to fulfill a task and to do your job when people are constantly moving around timelines or setting unrealistic expectations, right? In order to solve a problem, there has to be a tangible solution. So look out for people who are utilizing these types of tactics against you in a professional capacity, because typically they're not interested in propelling you forward. They have every intention to hold you back or to keep you stagnant. Another thing to note about all of this, right, is typically people don't find out about these codes of conduct until they're deep within this particular environment, right? And this is typically how a lot of professional spaces work, specifically when we talk about navigating it through like this lens of power, right? It's important to understand that when you are being propositioned with something, they are typically going to take you through a love bombing or a honeymoon phase, right? And this is why when you start to acclimate yourself to a professional space, you prioritize learning the lay of the land before you make any sudden move, right? So another thing to note is this, and this is very important. And when you begin to acclimate yourself to this environment, one of your greatest cheat codes is paying attention to whoever the ringleader is in that said environment, because the ringleader is going to provide context as far as how they conduct their reign. So this is going to save you a lot of time as well. One of the biggest mistakes, in my opinion, that I believe a lot of people make in professional spaces is when they observe somebody else receive mistreatment, right, under the hands of, a prominent person in a particular environment, a leader, a supervisor, a boss, one of the mistakes that they make is thinking that, well, if I just walk on eggshells or if I move around it, I can avoid it. No. It's important to understand once a person has reached a prominent position, once they've reached a position of leadership, they are very intentional and strategic with their reign. So a person who is leading with an iron fist is an individual that you have to watch out for, because 9 times out of 10, they are not interested in helping lift people up. They are more invested in keeping people at their feet. But to provide some additional context, I'm going to read from a final excerpt in the book Green Eyes, and the excerpt is titled, "Always Pay Attention to the Last Man Standing." And the excerpt reads, "Sometimes it's helpful to detect an envious person who doesn't pose an immediate threat to you, but to someone else. One may ask, wouldn't it be best to steer clear and avoid? Not necessarily. You never know when you may be next to feel an envious person's wrath, especially if the envious person defeated another target. They are prone to become arrogant and ruthless. In this situation, pay attention to the last man standing." So in sum, you have to understand when you are navigating systems of power, you are essentially navigating a symbolic lion's den. And in order for you to protect yourself from predatory personalities within such systems, you have to prepare for what you are coming up against. All right, babes, that's all that I have for this analysis. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. But of course, I want to hear you all's comments, opinions, perspectives, and even your personal experiences with situations like this in the comment section below. I look forward to speaking to you guys in the next one, babes. Take care.